Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I'm back for the first video of the new year. I know that I've been taking a little bit of a break, trying to honestly rest up a little bit, been a little under the weather, but I know that you're here for the best meta breakdown from two of the biggest tournaments that we've seen all weekend, including a top 32 prediction for the Ursiiday tournament. But let's get to the Pocket Legends tournament. So really quickly, I'm just going to talk about the metagame breakdown for the Pocket Legends League. And for this time zone, I believe it was mostly, kind of catered to the Asian countries of the world. Maybe a little bit of Europe kind of falls into the same part of the, I guess the beneficiaries of this tournament. But remember, Pocket Legends, what they try to do is move the tournaments around every weekend. So that way, multiple parts of the world get a chance to play at an opportune time. But just looking at this, Mewtwo was by far and ahead the most played deck. Even when you go ahead and count up all the Pikachu variants, Pikachu came in second most played. Then you got Gyarados, then you got Exeggutor and Serebii, which, by the way, just to kind of get this out there, there's a little bit of a weird characterization with Exeggutor and Serebii, where there's some just pure Exeggutor and Serebii decks, like that's all they play, and maybe like a Mew. And then there's some decks that play Exeggutor, Serebii, and Superior. So we'll try to break that down when we talk about the Ursiiday top 32. Then you kind of go on to Charizard and Moltres, Serebii Superior, Aerodactyl Primeape, Charizard Arcanine, aka Archizard, and then Exeggutor Mew. Let me scroll down a little bit. I know that it's going to mess up the visuals and cover up some of the other decks, but hopefully you've had time to kind of pause or at least check them out. But just kind of looking at some of the other decks that were played. Golem Dredagon continues to be played, even though it's not performing very well. Probably like a one-shot wonder, one tournament wonder there with that deck when it comes to these big giant tournaments that are like 400, 500 plus people. Aerodactyl Farfetch'd, you saw about 10 of those. Arcanine Moltres, so that's just the pure Arcanine, deck for the most part. Now, again, there are some weird characterizations with this, but you can kind of see the rest of the meta there. But anyways, let's get into what the standings were. So looking at the standings, this is kind of the end of the tournament here, but basically Sandy Magoob ended up winning it, so shout out to Goob. Really great to see a very consistent performer in these tournaments, and it kind of shuts down that argument where people kind of are like, oh man, this game is all luck. So that ends up being the tournament winner, and then top four kind of rounding out two fire decks, and then you've got Gyarados, Greninja, and then the winner Pikachu and Zebstrika. Now let me go ahead and actually show the combined. Yeah, so this is the combined standing, so you can kind of see the rest of the breakdown of the top 32. But one of the reasons why I'm not able to do a big breakdown of this tournament, compared to what I'm going to do with the Ursiiday tournament, is that they have a different kind of cutoff, where a little bit of their day two is a little bit of Swiss with the top cut, so that's why it's a little bit more difficult. But you can kind of see the top cut here. A lot of Mewtwo, a lot of Serebii, a lot of Exeggutor, and then you've got a few decks that are playing, Mew as well. And then just scrolling down here, you got the Aerodactyl Primeape deck, kind of running out, some of the rest of the decks here. And then again, just a lot of Mewtwo. One of the things that I would probably say about the state of the game is that you've got these three big decks, right? You've got Pikachu, Zebstrika, you've got Gyarados, Greninja, and then, you've got Mewtwo. And the other decks are kind of just trying to find out, can I beat two out of those big three, right? That's why the Aerodactyl and Primeape deck saw a lot of success. It was able to pretty much, have a pretty good matchup against two out of those three decks. Then you got decks like Serebii that can, they can high roll some of these matchups, but definitely get two out of the three for sure in some cases. And then you've got decks like Archizard, these fire decks where, hey, if they draw well, if they get that Arcanine early, it's very tough for any deck to deal with them. So all these decks kind of have, a different matchup, and then Scolipede just continues to be just dead. Okay, so now let's talk about what's going on in the Ursiiday tournament. But basically, one of the things that I wanted to do is get into some predictions for how I see these top matchups going down. So we'll get to that towards the last part of the video. But just taking a look at the top 32, you can see that Mewtwo Gardevoir took up the most spots in the top 32. Gyarados Greninja took up 7 spots. Pikachu Zebstrika took up 6. Egg, Serebii, and Superior took up 3. Executor and Serebii took up 2. Ursiiday took up 2. Aerodactyl, Primeape, Articuno Greninja, and Arcanine all took up 1. Now, you can kind of take a look at the percentage of like the entire meta and then how many were in the top cut. And clearly, you know, Mewtwo and Gardevoir are pretty much doing very well in terms of that conversion rate. And then so is Pikachu's Zebstrika. If you wanted to go a little bit more into the numbers, I mean, Egg Serebii Superior did pretty solid. Egg Serebii maybe a little bit less. And then the decks that are like one-ofs did pretty well considering how many people brought it to the tournament. But again, one of the requests that I saw in my last week's video, especially in the Discord, was like just kind of breaking down how many were X2. And so I actually ran those numbers as well. So in terms of like the top 80 people that were X2, even the X2 one person, 24 Mewtwo decks, 12 Gyarados, Greninja decks, 10 Pikachu Zebstrika decks, Egg Serebii Superior, there were 8 of those decks, 4 Ursiiday decks, and then you can kind of read the rest of those. You can screenshot that. You can, you know, use that however you want. But that kind of gives you an idea of, you know, what decks you're seeing in the X2 range. Because again, in a tournament like this, like going X2 is like nothing to be ashamed of. Like that's actually a really good job. I mean, you're looking at a tournament that's like what, 1,900 people. It's a long grind, and ultimately, you know, your tiebreakers are going to do most of the talking, right? Like you're going to have to be very lucky and go X1 and then hopefully draw in the last round, worst case, and then get in. But it's just very difficult to actually like win these tournaments, let alone like top them, right? So again, that's just a little bit of a breakdown that and kind of going into the top, you know, 80 players of this tournament that all went X2. Overall, this is about what you would expect. Like, if I'm honest, right now, I would say that the meta is kind of in a stalemate. Like, you're going to keep seeing those 3 decks be very, very good just because they're all good at what they do. And you're going to have, you know, these splash performers like, you know, this week it was Egg, Serebii Superior. And, you know, there's a debate like, do you even play the Superior, right? But anyways, like, you're going to keep seeing that. You're going to keep seeing Ursiiday pop up just because that Charizard bulk and the fact they can one-shot everything is like still a factor. And then obviously can high roll with Arcanine. That's going to continue to be a thing. But, you know, the Aerodactyl Primeape deck didn't do as hot this weekend. I think, you know, maybe a lot more people were used to seeing what it was going to do. And then in combination of more Executor, Serebii, and Superior decks kind of wash that deck out a little bit as well, because the fighting deck does have, and all the fighting decks roughly, have a tough time dealing with Erica, Executor, and Serebii. Very tough to deal with in a lot of scenarios. So that's kind of the idea of what's going on there. We're definitely needing the new set to really shake things up, and we'll talk more about that in another video, but that's just kind of the state of the game right now. But let's get into the top 32 cut. So last week I went ahead and did a full bracket breakdown, and honestly it took a lot of time and the bracket really sucked. So I'm not going to do that again. I'm just going to go over the top 32 and then my predictions for who might win this entire tournament. But let's go ahead and start with the number 1 seed on my left versus the number 32 seed. And this is a tough matchup draw for the Gyarados player. If you actually take a look at the data, I do believe that Gyarados has about a 40% win rate going into this deck. So, you know, with that in mind, it does seem like the fighting deck is going to have a great shot to move on and upset the number 1 seed. So just kind of looking at it, I'll go with the fighting deck to knock it out. I do think that having Hitmonlee is going to be a big advantage. Now the question is, are they going to see it in time? Because they only play 1, right? So that'll be the big question, but I'm going with the fighting deck to win the first matchup of the top 32. All right, taking a look at the second matchup here, we've got the 2 seed versus the 31 seed. This is going to be a Mewtwo versus Serebii matchup, which is really fascinating for a lot of reasons, right? Like the first thing that I would point out is if Executor hits the board very early, it's tough for Mewtwo to kind of like maneuver around that. They're going to have to soak some damage and probably switch in the other Mewtwo. And then when you take a look at the deck list, there is one Giovanni in the Mewtwo list that can help one-shot an Executor EX. But outside of that, there's going to have to be some sort of chip damage that chips the Executor and sets it up for the one-hit KO. when you take a look at the Serebii deck, the double Sabrina should come in handy, especially if there's an early Executor. Then you can also notice that they're running the 2-2-2 lineup for the Snivy Superior line. And that's something that's a little bit of a change up from the people that have been running 1-2-2. But again, pretty standard trainers there. You don't see any Leaf, which I kind of disagree with. But again, it's a space issue. But at least they do have X speed to kind of help that out. And when you take a look at the Mewtwo trainers, you do see that inclusion of one Sabrina as well as one Giovanni and one Blue. Now, in my mind, I probably wouldn't play Mewtwo right now if it didn't have two Sabrinas. That's just my personal choice, and I probably would be playing a non-basic EX attacker as well. But again, it's a space issue. So you see that one Leaf, one X speed to help pivot. As far as the matchups go, Egg Serebii Superior has had a little bit of an advantage in this matchup at 54.461%. But looking at these deck lists, I'll tell you what, this one's a really tough one. I'll probably just go with, I'll probably end up just going with the Mewtwo list to win this matchup. Okay, moving on to the 3rd seed versus the 30th seed in the top cut. This is another Egg Serebii Superior deck going into a Gyarados deck. Now, there's a lot of weird interactions here, like, for example, Executor attacking into Druddigon is very likely to happen, and if you flip heads, you feel pretty good about it, because then you're like, hey, I'm only going to take 20 more damage, and then I can Erica the damage away, so that way Gyarados, potentially, unless they have Greninja as well, can't one-shot me. So there's some weird math with Executor going into this deck. Then, ideally, if you're the grass deck here, you want to have that Superior, you want to have Executor early, and then you want to just build up that Serebii. So hopefully by the time Serebii comes in, you can flip a bunch of coins and pretty much guarantee yourself a knockout, as opposed to, not being sure if your Serebii is going to be able to knock something out like a Gyarados EX, because again, that's going to be the main way that you're going to get rid of Gyarados EX. When you take a look at the Gyarados deck, it's just very standard, right? There's nothing crazy here. And again, just kind of looking at this Egg Serebii deck, you got the 1 X speed, you got the 1 Leaf, you got the double, you got the, I think it's, what is it, only 1 Erica, which is a little, that's probably going to come back and bite them in this matchup, I would imagine. Especially when you see a card like Druddigon and cards like Greninja, so they might really kind of miss that other Erica. That's something that kind of stood out to me. And again, maybe they're a little bit heavy on pivot cards like X-Speed and Leaf when they do play the Superior. But again, it's hard to say. Obviously, they've gotten this far. Matchup-wise, when you take a look at the numbers, Gyarados Greninja has won 56.96% of the time in this tournament for this matchup. Just looking at the composition of this deck, give me Gyarados to move on. It's going to take a lot of Executor to win this matchup if the Executor player is going to move on. All right, stop me if you've heard this matchup before. You have a Mewtwo deck going up against a Pikachu deck, right? Obviously, classic Apex meta. In this specific matchup, you will notice that the Mewtwo deck is sporting a couple of potions, which might come in handy in this matchup. You also see a Budding Explorer and Mew combination there, which definitely might help, especially when it comes to soaking damage. One thing that I do want to point out with this Mewtwo list is the inclusion of one pivot card, which is a Leaf. That's it. No X speeds, so that's really interesting as well. I know that in my deck list, I've been cutting down to one pivot card when it comes to X speed and Leaf, so I definitely echo those statements. However, I've only been playing one potion. If I even squeeze it in, I don't even think I have room for it. Also, no Giovanni in this list, no Blue. So in the mirror match, this Mewtwo deck, very, very interesting, right? When you take a look at this Pikachu deck, the inclusion of red card could pose a problem if, that Mewtwo player ends up using those researches, trying to dig very early and gets ultimately punished by red card. The blind red card is always a thing too, so that's a possibility. Zebstrika, Zapdos, Pikachu, and then the base Zapdos. I don't know why the base Zapdos is in there. That card is awful, but that's what they've chosen to play with, and obviously, they made it to top cut, so they're doing pretty well. Double Sabrina, pretty standard by now. double X speed, obviously, and then 1 potion. When I take a look at these deck lists, I think that the Mewtwo deck list just has a lot of tools to deal with what the Pikachu deck is trying to do. In the mirror match, I think this Mewtwo deck probably loses the mirror match if it goes up against, a Mewtwo deck that's packing that blue, that Giovanni, and so on. But that's just my thoughts. But give me the edge to the Mewtwo player on the right here. The Mewtwo player that's actually, yeah, it's on the right. Sometimes the screens don't match up, But anyways, give me the Mewtwo player here. All right, so we've got a tough draw here for this Exeggutor Serebii deck going into a Arcazar deck. Now, one thing that I would immediately point out is the matchup is very, very slanted right now in the tournament data towards the Arcazar deck with a 73.33% win rate. So, in all reality, Charizard's probably going to win this matchup. Obviously, the type is going to have something to deal with it, but also when you take a look at the bulk is going to kind of pose a weird problem here too. Now there's the chance that Exeggutor comes out early and Exeggutor's flipping heads, and all of a sudden that Moltres doesn't have very long to accelerate, or maybe the Charizard Arcazard player is not able to find stage 1s or stage 2. That's definitely a possibility, but I think that more times than not, the Charizard deck is going to move on here in advance. As far as the deck list, I do like the Charizard deck list a lot. It is worth pointing out that they're playing 2 of every Pokemon. They do have 1 Sabrina in this deck list, which is something that some Arcazard players are not bringing in this matchup. They're just really slim on the trainers. Then when you take a look at the Exeggutor and Serebii and Mew deck, you do see that double Erica, you see that double Sabrina, the double X speed, double potion. So they got a lot of heal, but again, in this matchup, there's just going to be a lot of times where I don't think that the potion and the heal really matters. That was one issue that I ran into when I used to play Venusaur Exeggutor a lot. Sometimes these fire decks are just one-shotting everything, and your Ericas and potion, they're just kind of dead. So that could definitely be a factor. But give me the Charizard player to move on. Nothing spicy there. Okay, so going on to another Pikachu and Gardevoir matchup. I did not mention the numbers for this matchup, but in this tournament so far, Mewtwo is winning about 58% of the time over the Pikachu deck. So Mewtwo definitely has the advantage if you take a look at it from the numbers point of view. When you take a look at these deck list, again, double Sabrina for the Mewtwo player, double Leaf. So they're going to be able to pivot, no Budding Explorer to kind of soak damage on that Mewtwo. So they're going to definitely depend on hitting Gardevoir and then using Mewtwo to just sweep. When you take a look at the Pikachu player, they do play 2 Dedenne, which is a little bit different than some Pikachu list, but you'll notice that they're packing double Sabrina, double Giovanni. So there is a chance that Mewtwo kind of takes control of this matchup. If they're unable to find that Mewtwo or that Gardevoir, it could be a little bit of an issue. But more times than not, when it comes to this specific matchup, I mean, honestly, throw out the numbers. All that matters is, does Mewtwo draw Gardevoir? And then on the other hand, does Pikachu, draw those auto play hands where they just get Pikachu basics and then they're just able to X speed and move out and Sabrina stuff on the bench and just kind of autopilot? That's going to be the big question. Personally, I'm going to lean more towards the Mewtwo deck winning this matchup, even though there's nothing spicy, there's no blues, there's no Jinx to help kind of ease the first knockout. But yeah, give me the Mewtwo deck to move on in this matchup. Okay, so for this matchup, we've got another unfortunate matchup for the Grass player. The Grass player only playing Serebii and only playing Exeggutor going into a Fire deck. Now, this is straight disaster. This is not a matchup that you want to see if you're a Grass player. But hey, you just got to hope for bricks, right? You got to hope for them not opening Moltres every game, right? And, you just got to hope that ultimately you can draw Exeggutor early and just immediately start pressuring. Now, is that going to happen? I mean, who knows? But give me the Charizard Arcazar deck to win this matchup and move on to the next round, partly because of the type advantage and partly because, hey, I mean, the Grass deck is super linear in what it wants to do, and this is just the worst, probably the worst matchup they can get. Maybe Blaine's is worse, but Blaine's, you can at least get value out of the Ericas and the potions. So we've got a classic Mythical Island matchup here. We've got the new Serebii Exeggutor and Superior deck going up against the new Greninja and Gyarados deck. Now, in terms of the matchup numbers, for this matchup, it does seem to be a little bit slanted towards the Gyarados matchup. I think we've already kind of covered this matchup a little bit earlier today in this video. But again, just it's going to come down to, hey, does Exeggutor pop out early? If it pops out early, well then, hey, it might put a little bit of pressure, especially if it's flipping heads. So, you know, that's going to be the big key to this matchup. But I honestly, I would just go with the Gyarados deck just because you kind of know, hey, it definitely can brick and it definitely needs pieces to fall together. But, you know, hey, I do think that if it gets there in terms of finding the Gyarados, you know, and eventually being able to get those energies on it, I think that it can probably sweep a lot of, you know, the Pokemon that are going to come out, especially when it comes to everything but Exeggutor EX. So, again, a matchup heavily slanted towards, does Exeggutor EX pop out early? And if it does, could definitely spell some trouble for the Gyarados player, but give me the Gyarados player to move on to the next round here. Okay, we got the 9 seed going up against the 24th seed here. And when you take a look at these deck lists, one of the first things that stands out is this is not your standard / typical Gyarados and, you know, Greninja deck. It is playing one Giovanni as opposed to the double Leaf and no Giovanni. Not really sure why they're doing that, to be honest. It's not like you need the Mewtwo matchup to be better, and in all reality, I don't think it's going to matter very much, especially in this matchup when 140 is going to knock out literally everything, and then there's no blue as well. So yeah, kind of a weird inclusion there, but hey, maybe it works for him. I don't know, bold strategy, right? But when you take a look at the Arcanine deck, it does have one red card, which could potentially be a little disruptive. Only one Sabrina to snipe things on the bench. I just don't think that, you know, the only way that this Arcanine deck is going to win is opening Moltres, flipping heads, and then finding Arcanine on curve immediately. Like that's the only way that this deck is going to be able to knock out this Gyarados deck, and I wouldn't want to bet on that. When I take a look at the matchup percentages, I mean, this is 74% advantage Gyarados in this tournament. So yeah, give me the Gyarados deck to move on and head into the top 16. Okay, we've got, I believe this is the first time we've talked about this matchup today. Yeah, this is going to be Gyarados going into a Pikachu Zebstrika, so like a hard counter. So honestly, like, Gyarados is probably going to lose, right? So let's get that out of the way. In terms of the win percentage, like, it's a 72% win rate for the Pikachu Zebstrika deck. But let's talk about these tech inclusions for the Pikachu deck really quickly. Double Sabrina, so that's, again, nightmarish for the Gyarados deck. One blue, and, like, blue is a card that I don't agree with in Pikachu Zebstrika because it just doesn't really matter a lot of the time. Like, the only matchup it's going to really pop up is maybe the Arcanine matchup. So, you know, there's that, but I just don't think that it applies to too much. Sure, you could say Marshadow is a thing that it could, you know, help survive, but, you know, again, it's just so narrow. I don't necessarily think that it's worth the spot. However, when you take a look at the deck list, there definitely is room for it. I mean, you can't debate that, right? That last blue spot could be a red card. It could be another Giovanni. It could be another basic to try to, you know, increase your percentages of getting that full bench for Pikachu. But again, you know, you can't really go wrong with that last spot. And so I definitely understand people going with blue. Another notable inclusion in this deck is the inclusion of Leaf. And what that does, and I know a lot of people don't agree with it, and like the reason why people are playing Leaf and Pikachu is to give themselves another pivot. So, you know, it's just, hey, I've used all my X speeds, but I still have Leaf, so I can still like save an energy. Can be really huge in some matchups. And then Dedenne is just a solid, you know, solid bench filler. Every now and then you'll flip heads with it and be like, you're just really good at life. The Gyarados deck, the only spicy thing about this is one Leaf, one X speed, right? Outside of that, it's pretty standard, exactly what we're used to seeing. But give me the Pikachu Zebstrika to move on. No questions asked. All right, so how about this matchup? Articuno EX along with Greninja and Druddigon going into a Gyarados Greninja Druddigon deck. Gyarados is just going to wreck everything in this deck, so Gyarados, in my opinion, should win. However, if you look at the matchup data, it's a low sample size, but for some reason, Gyarados Greninja is losing to this deck in the tournament. Now, I don't know why. I mean, it's kind of hard to understand like how that's happening outside of Misty.deck, right? Like Misty on Articuno, maybe that's been the case. But I think that's probably the only chance that this deck really does have to beat a Gyarados deck. I don't really see any other paths. I mean, sure, Gyarados, Greninja could brick, but I would lean heavily towards Gyarados and Greninja in this matchup, even though, yeah, again, there are those high roll potentials where Misty even gets 1 energy on that Articuno earlier, and all of a sudden Blizzard is just destroying the Gyarados Greninja deck. But I'm just assuming that Gyarados is going to come out at 2 out of these 3 games and just wreck, right? Just sweep the entire team and lead to victory. Notable deck inclusions, the potions for the Articuno deck, I don't think that they're going to matter, right? Because a lot of the time things are just going to get one-shot by Gyarados. If the Greninja player has to attack with Greninja, maybe that's a little bit tricky. But again, give me the Gyarados deck to move on, even though the numbers do say otherwise in this matchup so far for this tournament. All right, we've got Mewtwo going into Pikachu's Abstrika. Pikachu player is bringing double Sabrina and a red card as well as 1 potion, so pretty standard. No blue in that deck. When you take a look at the Mewtwo deck, it is bringing 1 Sabrina, 1 blue, double leaf, and then 1 Giovanni. So there's some different trainers that we've seen compared to some other Mewtwo decks. Again, overall, Mewtwo typically has the advantage in this matchup, and so it's really hard to go against the Mewtwo deck for this particular matchup, unless you just have a gut feeling in terms of going against the numbers. Double Sabrina and Pikachu decks does help quite a bit in a lot of matchups, and I think this is one of them. I think it allows them to potentially ping damage and then snipe things out with Sabrina along with Abstrika and Pikachu. So there's a lot of good synergy there. And then again, when you see red card, it can mess with the stage 2 decks, even though cards like Mythical Slab exist for the psychic decks. But give me the Mewtwo player moving on and just getting Gardevoir on curve and playing Mewtwo in some form or fashion in 2 out of those 3 games. Yeah, so we got another matchup that Gyarados just does not ever want to see, especially when it comes to a top cut elimination matchup. And not only is this a bad matchup, they're even playing Electabuzz. So let's talk about this Pikachu deck list first. On the right, you've got double Pokeball, you've got double X-Speed. Obviously, you got double Sabrina and double Giovanni. So like their deck is going to be very linear in what it wants to do, as well as the inclusion of 1 Dedenne, 1 Electabuzz, only 1 Zapdos EX. I mean, just a very solid electric deck, especially when you talk about, oh, hey, we're playing against a Gyarados deck. When you take a look at the Gyarados deck, again, a little bit of spiciness, not really, right? Like you're changing 1 card, but Sabrina is included in this deck instead of playing double Leaf. So maybe that Sabrina could play a role, but honestly, with Pikachu, it usually doesn't matter, right? Sabrina is not necessarily a really bad card to see unless you get into these weird scenarios where you have damage like soaked on your bench if you're the Pikachu player, so you have a lot of EXs with damage on them and you're just hoping to avoid Sabrina late game. But realistically, Gyarados is just going to either snipe things with Greninja or it's just going to one-shot things with Gyarados. But with 3 snipers in this Pikachu deck, give me the Pikachu deck to move on. It's going to take an incredible run of luck for this Gyarados deck to win this matchup. Okay, so we've got a Pikachu deck going into a Mewtwo deck again, and when you take a look at this matchup, the Pikachu deck, pretty standard, just double Potion, 1 Giovanni, double Sabrina, so pretty standard outside of that. When you take a look at the Mewtwo deck, 1 Leaf, 1 X-Speed, no Jinx, Mewtwo EX at 2, and then 1 Mew EX, double Sabrina, 1 Giovanni. I mean, pretty standard stuff. Again, we've talked about this matchup a few times already. I'm not going to harp on it. There's nothing crazy in these card choices, really. It's just going to be standard Pikachu versus Mewtwo for the most part. Give me Mewtwo to move on. But again, in this matchup, hey, it could honestly go either way, even though Mewtwo should have the advantage in a lot of these games if you play him over volume. Okay, so you've got a Mewtwo mirror match rounding out the last couple of games for the top 32 to move on. I do love Jinx. Obviously that's one of my favorite cards in these Mewtwo list. Taking a look at these 2 deck lists, the first thing that stands out to me is the deck on the right just not even playing Sabrina. That's pretty wild, especially when you talk about like how much Sabrina means in the Gyarados matchup that you probably are going to lose a lot of the time. But they're just foregoing all of that, just saying, forget it. I guess I just auto lose to that matchup. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't. But when I take a look at this matchup, not having Mew for the Jinx player is going to definitely be a factor, because now the player on the right can just send in Mewtwo and not really be scared of ever encountering a Mew. However, the player on the right with the Mew EX can pretty much know that if Mewtwo EX comes in, well, Mew EX can definitely clean it up in a lot of cases, right? Taking a look at some of the other trainer preferences, both players bringing red card, both players bringing double mythical slab. There is a little bit of a difference in the pivot, right? You got one leaf on the left and one X speed on the left, and then you got double leaf on the right. So they're very supporter heavy on the right in comparison, right? You got 5 supporters going up against, I guess 6 supporters, so it's a little bit of a difference, right? Not too much of a difference though. Then, when I take a look at this, one deck has Giovanni as well as blue, and then one deck only has Giovanni. So, look, I'm a fan of Jinx, but I think in this matchup, the player on the right should have the advantage with the blue, with the Mew EX, and the red cards will probably cancel each other out. Yeah, so give me the player on the right to move on in this Mewtwo mirror match. And rounding out the last match of the top 32, you've got another Mewtwo mirror match. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about these two lists. Obviously, the deck on the left. The deck on the left is not playing Sabrina and they're playing Pokedex. I digress. The deck on the right is playing Sabrina, Giovanni, and blue. So, you do have a lot of differences. Both players playing Mew, so that kind of cancels each other out. And then the deck on the left playing red card as well. Yeah, I'm just going to be honest here. I don't think that the deck on the left is built in a very optimal way. But it's just my opinion. I'm going to go with a player on the right to win in this mirror match. Who knows what happens? Very close seeding. Obviously, it's a mirror match, so a lot of things can happen. Give me the player on the right to move on to the top 16. And that sums up the predictions for the bracket. So that wraps up my first video of the new year, and I just want to take time before I give my final prediction to say thank you for helping this channel grow so much and just being a part of the journey that I'm on to create content for this game. It's been really enjoyable. I've had a lot of fun doing it. I plan on bringing more and more videos this year, more streams and so on. So thank you for tuning in, and definitely subscribe to see more content like this. As far as the winner of the Ursiiday tournament, give me Gyarados pulling off a victory, even though there's a ton of hate in terms of the meta. Give me Gyarados knocking out probably a Mewtwo deck in the finals. Give me that. Yeah, so Gyarados is the winner. I don't know who it's going to be, but that's my final prediction.